Deep listening.
Whakarongo hohonu.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
الاستماع العميق.
L'écoute profonde.
Deep listening. Impact beyond words.
I think waiting for meaning is something, or discerning whether something actually has meaning in a conversation has really helped me in non-deaf communities. Just realising how much unnecessary small talk or beating around the bush we really do.
In this episode of Deep Listening, I was delighted to spend time with Jennifer, an Auslan interpreter for the deaf community, exploring the conversation where Jennifer explained she was standing on stage in Hyde Park in autumn and translating an extraordinary piece of poetry to a group of people who were in the dark. It was quite moving. The energy that Jennifer brought to the conversation really moved my perspective on what it means to listen deeply. I was humbled in the way that while she was speaking to me as a non-deaf person, she completely signed her way through the conversation. I'm sure that will come through in the interview. Let's listen to Jennifer.
Deep listening.
Tiefes Zuhören. Kuyingisela swinene.
Deep listening.
Welcome to Deep Listening, Impact Beyond Words. I'm so excited today to be interviewing Jennifer, an Auslan interpreter for the deaf community. She's actually in the studio with me and she's doing a beautiful job with her hand gestures during the dialogue and part of me goes, the Italian in me wants to come out and sign along with her. I think it's paradoxical though, because I think in the deaf community, because they listen to body language so much more deeper than the non-deaf community, I think they can pick up on those cues without interpreters sometimes.
That's true.
And I think because the deaf community are so in tune to the non-verbal signals, I think they're listening on a frequency that the non-deaf community have no idea. What would you say is one of the strengths, either in a social setting, that deaf communities have practices or cultures that you think non-deaf communities could learn from?
I think a lot of it is turn-taking. If you're standing in a circle, a group of people that are signing to each other and people start signing at the same time, obviously you can't look at more than one person at the same time, although you can slightly listen to two things at the same time, although obviously not at an optimal level. So deaf people tend to be quite good, as well as generally maybe being blunt. They can say, okay, stop, you go first, and then I'll go, and then Sarah can go. So they are really good at doing that and respecting the space and time that people have. And I think that that's something that a lot of non-deaf people maybe would benefit from.
In your own practice, when you're in non-deaf communities and you're listening to dialogue, what practice do you bring from sign to make you a deeper listener?
I think finding meaning. With interpreting, as I said, it's not the words. Interpreting for politicians especially, there's just so much faff on top of everything that they're saying. Sometimes when I'm interpreting it for a politician, they might start speaking and there's so many roundabout ways you can start a speech. So something like, well, we've noticed that there's been quite a bit of things that are happening in this space. There's been a really big shift that's been going on, and you're like, okay, so, and sometimes I can stand there and wait. So I know they're generally talking about a change, but I don't really have enough to go off. I can't start something that's very clear. And often people, such as politicians or managers, I find managers of big companies or banks tend to look over at you like, you're not meant to be signing right now. And you just kind of have to stand there because obviously you don't want to insult anyone, but they don't realise that they haven't said anything yet.
Yeah. What would be the sign for this manager's faffing?
There are ways of doing that, but I tend to try not to do that kind of thing. I think, again, like you said, deaf people can tell. They can see that perhaps the manager isn't saying anything concrete yet. They are good at picking up on that kind of thing. And I think they trust interpreters, which is a large amount of trust to know that we're waiting so we can do the clearest job we can. So I think waiting for meaning is something, or discerning whether something actually has meaning in a conversation has really helped me in non-deaf communities, just realizing how much unnecessary small talk or beating around the bush we really do.
For those listeners out there who aren't familiar with Auslan or sign language for the deaf community, just talk us through a bit of the structure. It's a very contextual language, and as you mentioned earlier on, it's three-dimensional, and there is much more palette to explore language through in sign than there is possibly in English or Latin derivative languages. So for those in the audience, just give them a quick sketch, if you would, of Auslan and how it's constructed and how it's used.
I'll try my best. I feel like a deaf person would definitely be the expert, but I'll give it a go. Auslan, I think, has apparently a very similar language structure to Asian languages. So the word order is different in terms of the verb. The doing word is often at the end of the sentence. So what you do is you create the scene first. So you create the picture with the man and the woman, and they're sitting at the desk and talking, whereas in English you might say they were talking sitting at the desk. So in some ways Auslan can be a very simple language in terms of grammatical rules, but it's also intensely complicated and rich in other ways, in thinking in such a visual sense, which as non-deaf people is a very different way to use language.
So the Jen story, your family comes from a very different part of the world. Talk us through how they came to Australia and how many in your family? What's a typical dinner conversation kind of sound like for you?
Well, I have my mum and my dad, and they were in search of heat, basically, which I always found such a bizarre concept when I was younger. Why would you move to the other side of the world purely for weather reasons? I have a brother, he's 4 years older than me, and he's a commercial airline pilot.
Okay.
And as soon as we got on the plane to come to Australia when he was 6 or 7, apparently he asked what this was and who was controlling us, and that was it. That is all he ever wanted to be.
Out of the 4 of you around the dinner table, who was the best listener in the family?
I think perhaps my dad, because he says the least, which I think can often be a good guide to who's listening. I think everyone has their time, I think, to listen, and I think a lot of it depends on the topic of conversation or what mood people are in. Because obviously around your family you can be a lot more selfish than you have to be around other people. But probably my dad, I think.
Okay. So your journey to signing, how did that start?
Well, unlike my brother, I had very little direction of what I wanted to do, and apparently when I was a little girl, they would ask what I wanted to do, and I just said I wanted to skip everywhere. I just want to skip all through life. And that was my life goal. But it wasn't until after I finished high school, I had a gap year and bumped into a girl that had left our school in year 10, and she said that she was studying Auslan. And I'd always been really quite interested in sign language, as I think a lot of people tend to be, perhaps learning the alphabet in primary school. I think a lot of schools do that, and our school had done that. And I was really fascinated by it, but I had no idea you could study it. And so meeting this girl and having no other kind of plans, I started doing an Auslan course, doing a certificate too, and was just hooked immediately. And my teachers, who are all deaf, said, if you keep going, you can keep studying throughout the courses and you could be an interpreter and you could sign every day. And that was that.
And what got you hooked?
It's so expressive. I think as I do like being creative, but I'm a terrible drawer and a terrible painter and I can't sing or play any musical instruments, but I love creativity. And I think Auslan is such a creative language. You use a 3D space around you. You create pictures out of concepts, which is just so bizarre and so unlike English, which is such a linear, structured language. So I loved being able to use expression, use pictures, refer to concepts in the space around you and set them up. I just found it so much fun. I really do find it a fun thing to do.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Escuta profunda.
What are the contexts you've signed in already? Some people big in auditoriums right at the front in broadcast mode. Some are in meetings, some are in job interviews, some could be in hospitals. What are the kinds of situations you find yourself signing in?
So many different situations. Especially with the rollout of the NDIS now, deaf people have a lot more control of funding and more funding is available for them to be able to request interpreters. Generally, I think I do most of my work in the corporate sector. So team meetings, interviews, training, that kind of thing, based a lot in this city area or Parramatta areas. So lots of work for government organisations, TAFEs, universities, hospitals, GP appointments, rallies, dinner parties, lunch meetings, all of these things.
Which one of those contexts has been most memorable for you?
I think I really like events where people are passionate. So I tend to really like rallies, especially if it's for something that I personally believe in as well. I find that really empowering to be able to be a part of the rally more so than just an attendee. You get to give access to a bunch of people and let them feel included as well. So I really like those things because it's those situations where you feel like you're making more of a change and making more of an impact.
Yeah. And who's the most powerful speaker at a rally and what topic have they spoken on that you've had to translate?
I remember interpreting for Get Out, the candlelight vigil for Alam Kurdi, who was the little boy that washed up on the beach that was quite famous around the world. And that was the biggest event that I did in Hyde Park. I think there was around 12,000 or 15,000 people there. And they had a lot of speakers, the Get Out speakers that they normally have. I can't remember the fellow's name, but the man that works at the Gosford Anglican Parish, who is quite well known for their boards and signs out the front. He did a really beautiful poem. And I find poetry and songs are very difficult to interpret because there's so many interpretations to how people might read a song or poetry or how they express themselves and what that means to each individual person. So we like to have a lot of time beforehand to work through that, read through the poem, try and think about the different interpretations, what the writer's intent is. So being thrown that was a little bit, while you're on stage in front of everyone, was a little bit of a shock. But he was such a beautiful speaker that it was quite easy to connect with him and understand what he was saying.
One of the things that foreign language translators balance is the balance between being totally unbiased as an interpreter and yet bringing meaning. Some of them call themselves additive interpreters and some of them call themselves subtractive interpreters where they try to get to the absolute essence of the message. In sign, how do you stay focused during... So let's take you back. Hyde Park, it was at night time.
Mm-hmm.
It was what time of the year?
I think it was coming into autumn.
Autumn. So it's probably quite chilly and you're standing up on stage.
Mm-hmm.
And how long are you on stage for?
It was about 40 minutes.
Okay. So staying focused for 40 minutes, talk our audience through how you avoid distraction during that period of time and stay totally focused while listening completely, while signing, while getting and hearing the audience response to it as well. There's so many dimensions going on. How do you keep yourself on track, Jen?
I think it's the fear of losing it because you know if you don't listen, you're going to completely lose the meaning. From past experiences when you do get distracted, like I've been distracted and have missed things and there's nothing you can do apart from having to stop the conversation and say, I'm sorry, I've missed that. As an interpreter, you want to be as invisible as possible. You want it to be as seamless as possible. So the fear of having to do that, especially in front of a huge crowd of people, is a big motivation to stay on top. But I think generally what I try to do is the person that's speaking is normally standing next to me because the deaf people, whether it's in a doctor's appointment or a meeting or on stage, they'd like to be able to see you and the speaker at the same time so their eyes can flip back and forth between you. So it's difficult to have eye contact with the speaker, which normally helps you listen. You can look at them. I find that I tend to kind of look down towards the ground at something that's non-stimulating so I can be as empty and as clear as possible to really listen to what the person said. And we normally have a time lag of maybe about 3 to 7 seconds between what the speaker said and us putting it out into sign language or in English if it's going the other way. So that gives us time to really listen for the meaning, which is the biggest thing in interpreting. It's not a word-for-word translation. It's figuring out the intent. So I tend to look down, have a minute to collect myself, try and really feel what that person is feeling. You know, when they walk on stage next to you, you feel their energy and you try and figure out what kind of a person they are, and that really gets me in the zone. And then when they start speaking, I give it a couple of seconds to try and get into the pace of them and then go from there and just stay as connected as you can the whole time.
So coming back to meaning, thinking about an experience where you went, wow, that meaning's really powerful. Do you have an example of how meaning making is the most potent thing an interpreter does?
I think, for example, in larger corporations, or I think in any kind of company, no one likes to use the word fired. And in English, we know that there's going to be a lot of restructuring around here is not a good sign. People know that that's what that means. But if I was to sign a very literal translation of restructuring, like restructuring, that is a very based on a physical remodeling. So that would not be an appropriate translation. So in those kind of situations, you would what we call unpack. When there's a word and the meaning in English is one word and it has a lot of connotations to it, but in Auslan you unpack that meaning so you make those connotations very clear. So if someone says restructuring, the deaf person, not all deaf people would think that, but it might be very easy to think that that means a physical restructuring of the office. So you'd be very clear and say that teams are changing or managers will be leaving or there will be some staff cuts is what you would have to say to get an appropriate meaning across.
Have you found yourself in situations where you've heard something kind of the first time and you thought this was the meaning and then the dialogue has continued, the meaning's changed nuance, and you've had to go back and explain that again?
Yes, definitely. It's those kind of situations where you have to let your pride go as an interpreter because you just want to be right and you want to be as subtle as possible. But sometimes if you know that the meaning has changed or either that you've also misinterpreted it, I've read the meaning as one thing and then later on I've realised, oh, that wasn't it at all, I've completely missed it, then it is that moment of having to, either if it's bad enough, having to pause the conversation and just say, oh, the interpreter has made a mistake, I just need to clarify something, and going back and making that clear.
Yeah, and we don't do enough of that in the workplace, in the non-deaf communities, when we do make meaning and we go really hard and we hold it really tight. And the meaning is all our meaning as opposed to the shared meaning there as well. So a lot of the time when you're interpreting, you're looking at the world through the lens of the speaker, and you want to be this kind of empty, unbiased vessel that's communicating the most powerful meaning to serve the group. What I noticed was fascinating, the way you just described, is the difference between having the attention on yourself and the pride and having the attention looking out to those you're serving and making sure you're looking after them. Again, for those who aren't watching and not in the room right now, the facial expression for Jen at that point where she talked about pride, her whole face just cringed, as it did with her hands. But I think this is the point we want to make, is that when we're not listening, we're probably pretty fixated on ourselves. Yeah. When we are listening fully, we're not only listening to who's speaking, but we're also keeping track of the dialogue, which is this abstract concept of the dialogue, which is not the speaker. To what extent are you conscious of the meaning in the dialogue, which is the interplay between two people, as opposed to what one person's saying and the other?
It's hard because cognitively, to be taking in something from the source language, interpreting it to, first of all, understanding what they're actually saying, and then putting that out in the source language is such a draining process, which is why interpreters, normally if there's a job's over an hour, there's 2 interpreters. So we take it in turns because they've done lots of research and the quality of interpreting really does start to decline after a while. So we try to, maybe around 15 or 20 minutes, cut it out before that so we can be at peak mode for interpreting.
So what I'd love you to do is summarise one tip for the non-deaf community that you think they can learn from the deaf community when it comes to deep listening.
I think just stop and check yourself. Think about what you're actually saying. And I think that can save you from a whole host of sins happening.
What an extraordinary way to finish our interview. Jen, you've expanded everybody's horizons who's been listening today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Escuchando profondamente.
L'écoute profonde.
Wow, I feel like a fog has been lifted as I sat down in front of Jennifer today. The three-dimensional nature of Auslan and the way she was able to express to me deep listening, impact beyond words, and how expressive that was. We decided to make a video of it. So in the show notes, you'll see a link to the video, and I'd love you to see the expression that Jennifer brought to the conversation when she spoke about deep listening and impact beyond words. The energy that she brought to a dialogue today with me showcased the power of listening completely to body language, and that more than half of what you communicate can be interpreted through body language alone. Sometimes we overuse our ears. So as you step out tomorrow and think about this, spend some extra time focusing on listening to body language. You'll be surprised what you learn, and you'll be even more excited about what you hear.
Deep listening.
βαθιά ακρόαση.
Deep listening.
گوش دادن عمیق.
Kipun tsitki.
Deep listening.
Kuuntele syvällisesti.
Deep listening, impact beyond words.